So for everybody that has submitted their rough draft, give me about a week and a half to get comments back to everybody. Those comments are, giving you comments are my priority. Most of you, if you answered all the questions in the rough draft prompt, you're going to get full points. For me, I'm not obsessing about taking points off for anybody's rough draft. The main point of the rough draft is the feedback. So what I want you to do is to not worry about the grade as much and instead make sure and read the comments I'm going to give you all. I do grade, sorry, I do look at the papers in the order in which they came in. So those of you that submitted it earlier will be the first batch I look at. Please don't be shy. I really want to emphasize this because I think a lot of us, I'm including myself, are really shy about reading other people's comments in our writing. We feel it very personally because these are our thoughts, our ideas. But the key thing to remember is that comments are not about you. Our writing is not a reflection of who we are necessarily, right? When people comment on our writing, it's just a reflection of the writing, how the writing can be better. And that's the whole point of getting feedback on it. So I'm emphasizing that for anybody that is going to be shy about it, because I'm never mean when I write comments on people's writings. The goal and what I'm primarily going to be commenting on is how to turn that rough draft into a final draft, right? Some of you, you've put enough effort into the rough draft that it'll be a smaller amount of work, but for most people, it's going to take some work, turning that rough draft into a final draft. So that's what I'll be focusing the comments on. So everybody will have comments. I'm going to do them not on Turnitin. I used to give you comments on Turnitin, but I'm going to do them through the Canvas side. So you should get an email when I get to your paper that the comments are ready. And usually what you have to do is go back into the assignment link and pull up the file from the assignment. So let's see, since I'm using this fake student here, nothing will show up, but you'll go down here, click on the file and be able to see your comments. I make them throughout the paper and I'll probably put them in the comment section of the assignment as well. Nobody has comments yet, but since I'm going to start doing those today, I want to give you a heads up. If anybody has trouble seeing my comments on your paper, to let me know, because I can always download your paper with my comments and email it to you, right? And it's really easy for me to do, so don't hesitate to ask for that. This is the important part of the process, right? Is looking at those comments and then working on that final draft. Now, you don't have to worry about it yet. The rough draft, the final draft for the racism in nursing paper is not due for like another 4 weeks. So I need time to first get you those comments. And those of you who haven't submitted yet, right, if you use the Life Happens clause or have an extension, then please finish that up. Don't overthink it. That was the main feedback I was giving people this weekend, is don't overthink it. The goal of the rough draft is to get thoughts on paper. Then we polish, then we make it better. Are there any questions on any of that? If you use the Life Happens clause, you have until Wednesday by midnight. But yeah, we're in week 10 of the semester, which means we're more than halfway through the semester. The semester is going to move really quickly. If you look ahead, like we're in week 10, we have week 11, week 12, week 13, and then we have week 14. That's the Thanksgiving break. After the Thanksgiving break, we only have like 2 weeks after that before final exams. It's going to move very, very quickly once we get to this point. So this is a good moment to like take a breather. That you have a ton of things to do, but please make sure that you're taking care of yourself as we finish this last, leg of the semester. We still have a lot to cover in here. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint I was using last week. We're talking about the World War. So we're going to go back to World War II. And then move on to the civil rights movement. Now, I'm not going to be able to get to everything that I had originally planned for week 10. So I've made a few changes in the schedule. One, originally I had assigned a Malcolm X reading for Thursday. I moved it till next week. So we'll talk about it on next Tuesday. We'll talk about the Ballad of the Bullet, which is a speech he gave. I've also modified the discussion board post. I think now that we are through this much of the semester, and that if you have any extra time, I want you primarily working on your racism in nursing paper, it makes more sense for the discussion board post to be smaller. So unless anybody has any objection, I think from now on, we will only have 1 or 2 question discussion boards. 1 or 2 questions, that's it. One, it'll be easier for me to grade and to focus on giving everyone back comments, but I also think this still helps us check and make sure everybody's understanding the main points without overwhelming you all. So no objections, right? To just 1 or 2 questions for discussion board posts from now on? If somebody does object, speak up, because if you don't speak up, I will keep, I will continue with this plan. Okay, no one's speaking up. Then that means I have to go in and modify some of this discussion board posts. So I will do that over the course of the next week. So just for anybody that's thinking about working ahead, which I don't imagine there's a lot of you. But okay, let's talk about World War II. Like I said before, I'm not talking about every aspect of the world wars. You can take, there's classes, we teach several classes in the history department completely dedicated to the world wars. So what I want to do in this class is, one, focus on those themes of race and ethnicity, but I'm still leaving things out. So for example, I am assuming that you have some knowledge of World War II, and I'm not going into like the Holocaust. Not because I don't think it's worthy of examining. When I teach my history of violence class, I spend a lot of time on the Holocaust and on the Armenian genocide and just genocide in general. But because I'm assuming you already got some units on the Holocaust, then I want to focus more on the Pacific and what's happening in the US. So that it can lead us into the civil rights movement. So I am assuming some knowledge, but if anybody ever wants to talk more about that or wants something to read on those topics, please don't hesitate to ask me. I enjoy teaching those subjects and I think they're very important, but you can't cover them in every single class. So what I'm going to focus here is talking about World War II as a war about land and race on both sides. On all fronts, right? And the race element and the land element can't be separated, right? When you look at Hitler, for example, part of the reason why he wants an empire, once he wants to expand beyond Germany, it's because not only does he want natural resources, right, but he wants land for the Aryan race to expand. That's a key part of racist, white supremacy ideologies. Eventually, they lead to warfare because the whole point is having more room for the Aryan race to expand and eliminating all other races, right? Well, the same thing is happening in the Pacific with the Japanese. The Japanese see themselves as the rightful racial rulers of Asia. That's why they're building an empire. Resources, because on an island they have limited resources, but also room to grow the race. On the U.S. side, we're going to see the racist attitudes very, very present. The room to grow the land aspect is not as big of a factor because the U.S. is a huge country. We have plenty of land. If you've ever traveled, driven across the country, we have a huge country. It's one of the first things that people that come to the U.S. Notice when they drive through the U.S. It's a lot of land. So that land specifically is not necessarily a need for the U.S., but economic control. And we'll talk a little bit about U.S. power after World War II. Exactly, Robert. The land's been taken. Like that part was already, it's already been part of that process. Yeah, and there were definitely racial attitudes there, right? Like it was definitely a white supremacist ideology that led to the creation of the U.S. territories, right? The land that is now the U.S. Thank you, Robert. Okay, so let's talk about war in the Pacific. Right? Like, again, I'm skipping war in Europe a little bit here. The Japanese were seeking an empire in Asia, right? And it's a complex idea when we look at it, because their quest for an empire is based on Western imperialism. Japan has been seeing how Western Europeans and the US were trying to build their empires in Asia, and really how successful they were, especially the Western Europeans, right? That so much of Asian territory was controlled by Western Europe, not entirely, right? For example, the Europeans are never able to fully control territory in China, large chunks of territory. They economically control China for a chunk of time, but they don't colonize China in the way that they had wanted, right? In other places, they had a hard time doing it, right? Like controlling India was very expensive, took a lot of effort. They're able to do it though. They're able to do it in a lot of places in Southeast Asia. So the Japanese, looking at all of this, feel like, wait a minute, that's not right, right? Part of their effort is challenging Western imperialism, kicking the European and the American powers out of Asia, but replacing them with their own empire. Japan sees itself as the racially superior group in Asia, right? And that idea of racial superiority is going to impact the way they run their empire building, right? The same thing had happened in Europe. The reason Poland, for example, is treated so harshly, the reason why the Soviet Union is treated so harshly over the course of the war, is because the Nazis have a particular ideology about who these people are. The Polish and the Soviets are seen as racially inferior people. Well, same thing in Asia. The Japanese see other Asian groups as racially inferior. Therefore, then, they have a right to control that land, which is very rich in resources. That's the ideology that's driving the Japanese in Asia, or part of it. As they look at Western imperialism, though, they felt they had two choices, right? That they either worked with the Western powers and foster free trade, right? Basically, sign up for this idea of free trade and become another power of the many powers trying to control Asia, or use force to push the Europeans out and replace them with a Japanese empire. Obviously, it is option two that they decide they're going to go with, right? And really, Japanese aggression, their empire building project, goes back well beyond the official start of World War II. The empire building in Asia gets folded into World War II, right? And it actually, we can say it begins before the Japanese move into Manchuria. Let me see, I have a map here. Yeah. As they're seeking to grow their empire, one of the first places they go to is Korea, right? By the time the invasion of Manchuria occurs, Korea is already part of Japanese territory. They control it. Then they move into Manchuria, then into China. So they start making their way down, and into Southeast Asia, right? This is going to become very important territory for them. And it's very important because they see like China and the Soviet Union as weakened, right? That they've been weakened, they've lost wars. And that's why they feel confident moving into some of these places. So it's not all just automatic. They're seeing the way that events worldwide are playing out and taking advantage when it serves their purposes. For example, after the invasion of China in 1937, which had gone pretty well for them, they're slowly building more territory in China. The Germans invade France, right? The war in Europe is happening. The Germans invade France, and the French immediately want to prevent another World War I. Right? World War I had been devastating, and a large chunk of the war had been fought in France. So they immediately begin talks to sign an armistice, a ceasefire, to stop any fighting. So France, and they will sign an armistice with the Germans, and France will be essentially out of the war. That story is actually complicated because you have Charles de Gaulle who flees to Britain and will try to raise troops and help run the war from there. But for all intents and purposes here, France is out of the war. That leaves large chunks of Southeast Asia open to Japanese aggression because the French controlled a large chunk of Southeast Asia. Particularly, one of the kind of prime colonies in Southeast Asia was at the time called French Indochina, modern day Vietnam, right? So Vietnam now, with the French weak and unable to assert their control in the colonies, is vulnerable. And the Japanese take advantage of that to move into those territories. So let me see if I have another map here. Yeah, so you see them moving here, going into French Indochina, and then they will be moving through the Southwest. So far, completely unstopped. Things are working in their favor. And so in 1940, they decide to form a pact with the Italians and the Germans, the tripartite pact. Now, initially, you might think like, wait, why are these three countries signing a pact? Their ideologies seem to be in conflict with one another, right? Like the Germans are all about Aryan superiority. What the hell are they doing signing an alliance with the Japanese, right? And same thing, why would Japan, if they're fighting Western imperialism, want an alliance with the Germans and the Italians? And why would they? You can tell me, why would these three countries be interested in working together? Any ideas? There's still a lot of racist ideology in their approach. The thing here is that they're all opportunists, right? If an alliance with each other is going to help them, then they will take it. And that's what they all think, right? The Italians and the Germans think that by forming an alliance with Japan, that they can scare the US into staying out of the war. They've already seen what's happened in World War I when the US joined the war and helped the Allies, right? Well, the Germans don't want the US in the war yet. And so they think that by bringing Japan into this alliance, that it'll scare the Americans into holding off longer. It actually will not, but that's part of the idea. And for the Japanese, right now, German aggression in Europe is working in their favor, right? They've knocked the French out of the world playing field, right? That left all their colonies open. Now the Japanese are thinking if the Germans can knock the British out, that will open up even more opportunities for them in Asia. Right? The British right now, I mean, they're vulnerable anyways because they're busy running this war. They can't run the war and protect their colonies. So for now, it works in their favor to be in this alliance. Now, Germany and Italy forming this alliance is an interesting one because they've already been aligned. The Italian fascism, right? At this moment, Italy it's under the dictatorship of Mussolini. And that when we talk about fascism, we're talking really about Italian fascism. Like the way scholars define fascism is very narrow. When we talk about fascism, it's what comes out of Mussolini in Italy. what's happening in Germany is a kind of fascism, right? But it's a very specific kind of German fascism. It's Nazism, right? If you ever want to go into fascist studies, it all gets very complicated and very specific, right? What's happening in Germany technically is not pure fascism, it's Nazism. And the Italians, though, it's very clear it's fascism. So their goals are aligned at this point. They've been working together and not getting in each other's ways. That's really one of the goals for the Italians, is they want to build their own empire. They're not interested in getting in the way of the Germans. They're interested in colonies and building colonies abroad and restoring Italy to the height of the Roman Empire. They're not going to quite achieve that, but that's part of what's bringing all these people together. Right. But I said this tripartite pact has the opposite effect of what they want, because everyone knew the Americans are coming into the war, right? Like both in Europe and in the Pacific, the interests of Japan are clashing with American interests. The Americans do want the Europeans to let go of those colonies. They want the end of European colonization so that they can replace it with American capitalism, right? They want those markets open to American businesses. So Japan controlling large chunk of China does not work in America's favor. So FDR and the Americans are sitting there watching that, knowing that eventually they will have to go to war with Japan, just like they eventually will have to go to war with the Germans, because they don't want the Germans controlling Europe, right? US wants to be in control of those economies. So in response to the tripartite pact, the US freezes Japanese assets in the US. There's quite a bit of Japanese money in the US, and all of that is frozen. Japan no longer has access to it. But the bigger deal is actually the embargo. The US imposes an embargo on Japan, and Japan sees that as a declaration of war. And the large chunk of it is that Japan is an island, that it needs resources from the outside, and one of the main things it needs is fuel. With an embargo, they are cut off from their source of fuel, and for them that means death. And so for them, this is very much a declaration of war, right? And so what do you act? What do you do when you feel like someone's just declared war on you? You retaliate, right? Now, everybody knew that this confrontation was coming, right? The Americans, the Japanese, maybe not the American people. The American people still very much against the war. But in retaliation for the embargo, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. At that time, Hawaii was not a state yet. There was some military base. It was an American territory. So it's a direct attack on the US, but it was not a state yet. So that's why the Japanese felt comfortable enough kind of bombing there. They also don't have the capabilities of attacking the West Coast yet. They're trying to, but they don't have the capabilities of reaching like California, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast areas. Pearl Harbor is a huge shock to the Americans, right? Huge shock. Some historians, or in history, some people wonder whether the US knew that the attack was coming. There was some sort of memo floating around in Washington that warned that it was possible. We don't know that FDR actually saw it. Regardless, it happens, and it drives the American public to become pro-war, to support the war. Right? Immediately after, FDR goes to Congress, gives his very famous Pearl Harbor speech, and the American Congress declares war on Japan. Now, initially, it's that narrow, right? It was war on Japan because of their attack at Pearl Harbor. But on December 11th, Hitler declares war on the US, right? Because of the alliance that they have with Japan. And shortly after, the American Congress declares war on the Germans, and the U.S. is now fighting a two-front war. So initially, the Hitler thinks that this is great, that the Americans were going to focus on the Pacific because the Japanese are the ones who have attacked, and that they will not be able to fight a two-front war. You usually don't want to fight a two-front war because your resources are going to be stretched thin, right? You need to have money and personnel, soldiers to fight in two different places, and that usually will hurt. It hurts any power trying to fight a two-front war. It's what Hitler's been trying to avoid in Europe, right? After the defeat of the French, there's the blitzkrieg of the British. The Germans heavily bombed the British, thinking that they can defeat the British and then move on to the Soviet Union. Except the British hold on. The British hold on. Britain is going to take a longer time. And now Hitler's in a predicament because he's going to have to fight a two-front war. He thinks it's going to be easy, right? Hitler thinks, and the Germans think, that the Soviet Union, that they can focus on the Soviet Union, defeat the Soviet Union quickly, and then come back to Britain. That's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen. This is where the racist ideas really create terrible war strategy, right? Hitler thinks that the Soviet Union is going to be easy to defeat because they're racially inferior people to him. Well, initially things go as he planned until he's stuck halfway into the Soviet Union in the middle of a winter with having made no preparations for it, right? And also the British holding on, and then he's stuck fighting a two-front war that is not a good idea. But the U.S. over here is also faced with the same situation, a two-front war. Initially, troops are sent into the Pacific, right, to the Philippines. General MacArthur and American troops get stuck there, make some poor decisions. The Japanese manage to surround the American troops, and they're stuck. They need reinforcements. But the U.S. government decides that, okay, war in the Pacific is going to take longer. So they decide, and FDR had already been making plans to focus on the war in Europe first. So the American troops that were stuck in the Philippines and in the Pacific theater are going to be stuck there until the U.S. can make progress in Europe and then turn back to the Pacific. Right? If you're interested in military history, all this stuff it's actually really interesting. I'm not even a military historian or military buff on these things, but what this means though in Asia is that the Japanese are moving completely unstopped. No one can stop them, not the Americans at this point. And so they have just been growing their empire. Right? This is all chunks of land controlled by the Japanese. At the same time, while we're focusing in the war in Europe, Japanese internment occurs in the United States. And this is why I say it's a war about race from all sides. The racial ideologies, the racist approach of the Americans and how we run the war is also very clear, right? Now, because war with Japan was inevitable, clear with the moves that they're making in the Pacific and with the U.S. interest in the Pacific, the Americans knew that eventually there was going to be war. So one of the things that FDR does is he commissions the State Department to send spies to the West Coast where a majority of Japanese Americans live. He wants to know what's going to happen when war finally breaks out. Will Japanese Americans remain loyal to the U.S. or will they become loyal to the emperor in Japan? And it's really all primarily in the West Coast. There were Japanese Americans in other parts of the U.S., but in very small numbers. The estimate is that there was around 125,000 Japanese Americans living in the U.S. at the start of World War II, with 80% living in California, specifically in California, primarily in Northern California, but in California, and 112,000 Japanese Americans living in the Pacific Coast. So Oregon and Washington included there. And so he sent spies to the West Coast, right, to California, to infiltrate Japanese American communities. And it's the State Department doing this because at this point, we don't have an official created FBI and CIA, right? So Curtis Munson is the State Department agent that comes and does his investigation. He hires other spies, infiltrates Japanese American communities, and what results from his investigations is what is now known as the Munson Report. It's a 25-page report. We know he files his report with the State Department before Pearl Harbor. Right. And we know that people at the White House read his report. We don't know if FDR specifically read the report, although it's hard to imagine that he didn't. There's no actual verifiable proof that he read it. Still, the State Department and the White House have read this 25-page report. And what the report says is that Japanese Americans will remain loyal to the U.S. In fact, the way they word it is that there was a remarkable, he says, even extraordinary degree of loyalty for the United States in Japanese American communities. He is telling the State Department and the White House they will remain loyal to the U.S. There's no way these people are siding with Japan and with the Japanese emperor. Now, this report, the public has only known about it for a small amount of time. For most of the time, we haven't known that this report existed. So people made all kinds of excuses for the internment of Japanese Americans. But despite the report, FDR still signs Executive Order 9066, which authorized for the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans in the U.S. These internment camps, some of them are in California. Has anyone had the opportunity to go to visit one of the internment camps? They're museums now, but I don't know if they take students there. No, nobody's been to one? They're a drive away, right? But they're within the state of California. What most families receive, though, is this flyer, right? Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. And the instructions are that to get ready. The minute that American officials come in, they have to, they can carry small luggage, but they're going to be removed. Very little notice. People have at most days to try to sell their homes or sell their businesses, sell whatever they have to get as much money as they can, because they don't know when they're going to be back and what they're going to need. So people try to scramble to sell homes and businesses, and a lot of people take advantage of that. When those businesses and homes are sold, they're sold extremely cheaply, because all the Japanese American families want is just to get some money out of it, because they're going to lose those businesses and homes anyway. People who don't manage to sell their homes get nothing for them, and when they return at the end of the war, most of them cannot take back any property or businesses that they held. Right, so they basically take what they can carry with them into the internment camps, and the internment camps were quite horrific. Right? They didn't even have enough beds for the number of people that were in these camps. There wasn't enough running water, enough sanitation. As a result, their overcrowded spaces, without sanitation, without running water, disease is rampant in the internment camps, and there's no provisions for medical care made at the internment camps. And so a lot of people die while interned in the camps. The excuse, right, that the U.S. government gives for the internment of Japanese Americans is one, that fear of what they're going to do, that they're going to be siding with Japan instead of the U.S. And public sentiment supported that, right? Now, remember though that a lot of this anti-Japanese feelings have been building for a long time. There's already a population of Americans that have completely bought this anti-Japanese feeling, right? Racist feelings are already there. Going back to trying to early Japanese immigration to the US. Plus, on top of it, all the anti-Chinese immigrant feeling is kind of folded into this, so that there's a lot of anti-just Asian American feelings in the West Coast. So that adds to the way the American public responds to Japanese internment, which is to allow it. Right? People are seeing entire neighborhoods become ghost towns from one day to the next. Their neighbors disappear, and nobody knows exactly what's going on in these internment camps. But mostly people don't care either. Right? When you see someone as other, too much not like you, right? When you've already dehumanized them, then it's really easy to not care what happens to them, even if it's the American government doing something. It's really easy. Plus, there was a lot of propaganda at the time, casting doubt on the loyalty of Japanese Americans and fear. In California, newspapers every day were posting about Japanese attempts to bomb the West Coast. Right? People were finding things on the beaches, some of which might or might not have been attempts of the Japanese to reach the West Coast, but people became paranoid about it. Right? All of them contributing to this huge injustice, right? There was also a lot of American propaganda trying to tell people like what to look for, how to find Japanese Americans. Because there was so much anti-Japanese sentiment, but the United States government is allied with the Chinese government at this time. Because remember, the Chinese have been invaded by the Japanese, and so they become American allies. And so the American government needed to be taught how to distinguish between Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans. And guess what? The American public could not, right? They were beating up anybody that looked Asian. It was so bad that Chinese workers would often wear signs in the back saying, not Japanese, Chinese, trying to prevent violence against them, because sometimes a mob would just see an Asian person and automatically to them, all right, they're Japanese and they need to be violently beaten. Right? It was pretty bad. The other excuse the U.S. government uses for the internment of Japanese Americans is to keep these people safe. Oh, there's so much anti-Japanese feeling that their removal from society and placed in these camps is for their own safety, is what the American government says. I don't know, what do you think? Do you buy the American reasoning? No. And that's the thing. This is why now, like, the Munson report is so important now, even though it only came out like within the last 10 years is when the Munson report became public. But it's really important because it tells us that, one, the government knew, like, they were already afraid of the loyalty of Japanese Americans. So they sent spies to the West Coast, but their own spies told them, no, people will remain loyal, right? In that case, then what's the excuse for all of this? Their fears are completely unfounded. And we see very clearly, sometimes, like, we'll make the comparison to how German Americans are treated. German Americans are never interned. Because the way that the US government handles German Americans was the way they should have handled any kind of spying they might have suspected from Japanese Americans, which is you arrest the person who is suspected of being a spy, you prove that they're spying in a courtroom, and they get sent to jail. There were some Germans caught spying in the US, and that's what happens to those that are caught. Like, when you're afraid of spies, there's a legal process already in existence to deal with spies. You do that. You let the process you've created work. But clearly, for a lot of us, the racism is clear in the way that Japanese Americans are treated in the US. There was no other real excuse here, right? Now, some people will talk about how the Japanese were trying to reach the California and like the West Coast. Like, okay, yeah, they were, because we're at war. To me, it still does not justify the internment of Japanese Americans. Has anybody read George Takei's? He has a graphic novel talking about his experience as a kid in an internment camp. There's other memoirs that people have written as well, but I'm like, his is, I've heard really good. I haven't read it, but because it's in a graphic novel format, I'm like, I'm hoping more people read it, because the further away we get from this history, right, the more survivors pass away and we lose their stories, the more important it comes to hold on to the stories we've been able to keep, and the people who have been able to speak out about their experience in these camps. What is it called, Jessica? That's a great question. In fact, let me pull up it. George Takei. So graphic novel. They called us enemy. That's the graphic novel. That's the name of the graphic novel. They called us enemy. And most public libraries, by the way, like it looks like you'll get it cheap enough in some places, but most public libraries have several copies of this graphic novel. And I have found, by the way, that I've been really into graphic novels lately, nonfiction ones, because they do such a great job of actually telling history and giving us images. So you're not committing to reading like large chunks of writing. Right? If you're like, my attention span cannot handle that, that's fine. These novels just give you a little bit of word, and through the images kind of teach us quite a bit. So I'm a big fan of these kinds of graphic novels. So they called us enemy, and he has a longer edition of one, and one that's aimed for a younger audience, for kids. So I'm like, highly recommended. But all right, once the war ramps up, actually, before I get to ending the war in Europe, one of the things that always gets me about the internment of Japanese Americans was that the US still needed soldiers, right? We needed, there's a draft, so we needed as much manpower as possible in order to fight and win this war. Okay. So one of the things the US military does, it goes into internment camps, Japanese internment camps, and it asks for volunteers to join the American military. Now, if you were a Japanese American in an internment camp, let's say you're a man of military age and you're healthy enough to serve, and your family's in an internment camp, and the military comes asking you to volunteer, would you do it? Maybe to get a gun. A majority of Japanese American men volunteer for the American military. There are some that objected, who refused, and they were put in prison. But a majority actually volunteer. Why do you think the majority of these men volunteer? Why these families are willing to send their men to fight in the military for a country that has them in camps, who's restricting their freedom? Why would people send their children, send their husbands to fight this war? This part always gets me. A large part of it was, yeah, Jessica, to prove their loyalty, in hopes that the American government will see that they're not siding with the Japanese, that they're willing to sacrifice their sons, their husbands, and let them out of the camps for better treatment in the camps. Yeah, that is what people express, that they wanted to prove their loyalty. And to me, it's one of those like extremely hypocritical of the American government to one, deny people their freedom and then ask them to fight in the name of freedom, because that's how the propaganda sold the war to the American public, right? Is that you're fighting to fight the Nazis abroad and bring freedom to Europe and freedom in the Pacific, right? It's all about freedom. Well, how can you, that might work, the propaganda works, a majority of the public, but how does that work for Japanese Americans when they're in camps? Well, there was still that need of, people thought if the government just realizes that we will be loyal, that they will let us out. And a majority of Japanese Americans who serve in the war, they were not going to be stationed by the, and even after they volunteer for the military, they were not stationed in the Pacific. They only allowed Japanese Americans to serve in the war in Europe because of fear that if they served in the Pacific, that they would like change their minds and side with Japan in the Pacific, which was not going to happen. I mean, these men were already volunteering, and yet the racism still played a role in where they were sent. But okay, they're sent to Europe, and there's two fronts in Europe, right? There's two competing ideologies on how to end the war in Europe. One called for the Normandy landings, right? For the US and allies to land in France, in the beaches of France, and then in France to fight their way into Europe, into Germany, right? So attack the Germans that way. The second plan was for the allies to land in North Africa. All of these places in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, they were French colonies at the time. During World War II, right, the French don't have tight control of these colonies. They're out of the war. They're busy being occupied. But the Germans also don't have good control of North Africa. So there is fighting that has to happen here, but without French or German control here, this is one of the potential strategies to ending the war, for the Allies to land in North Africa, make their way out to Sicily and Italy, and via Italy then to reach Germany that way. It turns out the Allies go with both plans. We know the Normandy landings happened, but the Allies also launched this North African campaign, landing all over North Africa. And this is part of why also the global aspect of the war is the battlefields are actually all over the world, right? So the Allies land in North Africa. It goes pretty well for the Allies. They're able to move into Sicily and into Italy. In Italy, they do have to battle their way up to Germany, but Mussolini ends up killing himself, and actually it doesn't present as large of a problem for the Allies. This is where most Japanese Americans serve during World War II, and most serve valiantly. They earn medals for their service in these battles. And like, to me, it's just remarkable, right? That and trying to help their families in the internment camps. These are some of the most like brave men that fight in this war, and they're doing it while their families are imprisoned in these camps. So, right, we know this goes well, and this is also the start of the Cold War, because as the Allies are making their way up Italy and through France, the Soviet Union then turns the war around in Soviet land, turns the Germans around, and everybody, now it's a race to see who's going to get to Germany first, who gets to control the post-war world, right? The Soviet Union or the Americans, right? And they have two very different ideologies and ways of looking at the world. The Soviets want to promote Soviet communism. Right? It's not pure communism what the Soviets have, but Soviet communism is what they want to reshape the world into. Well, the Americans want to reshape the world on a vision of American capitalism. Very different. Mm-hmm. Now then, with the war in Europe ended, the US then turns back to the war in the Pacific, right? By mid-1943, the US was pushing Japan back through Southeast Asia. They managed to recapture the Philippines. The story of the Philippines is very dramatic, really interesting. If anyone's ever interested in finding out more. By the summer of 1945, all the major cities in Japan are devastated. They've been heavily bombed by the Americans. It is clear by the summer of 1945 that Japan is defeated. And yet, they're not capitulating. They're not giving up. Like there's no way they're winning this war. Absolutely no way. But they're not sitting down to negotiate with the Americans. And that is part of the reasoning given by the US government for the use of the atomic bomb, that the atomic bomb was a way to force Japan into peace negotiations, that otherwise they were not going to. Right? And so on August 6, 1945, the US becomes the first country ever to use the atomic bomb, and it is dropped in the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the second atomic bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. And most of Japanese cities have already been bombed, right? So the US government actually picks Hiroshima and Nagasaki specifically because these are two cities that haven't already been heavily bombed during the war. And why do they want cities that haven't been heavily bombed? So that you can tell the difference in the destruction and the harm caused by regular bombing, and tell what is the effect of the atomic bomb. Because nobody's used the atomic bomb before, American scientists wanted to see the full effects of the bomb. And so we picked cities that had limited amount of destruction during the war. And it turns out it is horrific seeing the effects of the atomic bomb. Really, the most humane thing is to die instantaneously. People that were closer to the epicenter where the bomb is dropped die immediately. It's people in the outskirts of where the bomb is dropped that suffer the most because they experience heavy burning. I don't even like to put pictures of this because they're so horrific. Like people's skins looks like they were melting off their body. And there was no way to treat that. They're trying to treat this the way you treat burns, but this is the effects of an atomic bomb. Like that's not going to be enough treatment. And so there's no way these people were going to survive, right? But they're alive. They're alive, experiencing these intense pain. And there's very little that can be done to save them. So most of those people are taking days or weeks to die, but they're dying, right? Some people manage to survive if they are experiencing lighter burns, things like that. But the descriptions of how people die after are really, really horrific. And if anybody's interested, there's a lot of scholars that have been interested in the question of morality here. What are the ethical questions involved, right? Like, should the US, or was the US correct in using the bombs in this particular war? I'm not as interested in that question anymore. Like I have my answer on whether I think that this was a morally just cause or not. People can disagree on that, but if you're interested in exploring the question of ethics and morality here, the scholars have taken up and have made the case for both. So if you're interested in reading that, I think you can find scholars that make both cases, and then make up your mind from there. I mean, we're still the only country who has used this kind of weaponry. And to me, I don't like it, but some military historians make the case for why it was good military strategy. All right. The other thing here is, though, now the US is clearly a global power. Right. What the US does from this point on matters so much in global history. right? Including things like the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is not just an American movement. It's happening primarily in the US, but it really has a lot of international dimensions because the US is a world power, because everybody's looking at what's happening in the US, but also because after the war, there is a move to end colonial powers, right? For people to have the right to rule over themselves. A lot of the former colonies, former European colonies, are one after another getting independence, winning their independence. Not all of them, but they're slowly, the move is towards independence. And the US is actually promoting that. It is diplomatically trying to force the Europeans into giving up their colonies. But don't think that the Americans are doing this because it's the right thing to do. The Americans are not interested in Europeans letting go of their colonies because it's the right thing to do. They're interested because of the opening of economic markets abroad, right? In a colonial setting, right? When the Europeans have these large empires. Yes, exactly, Robert. When they have these colonial powers, the colony is obligated to sell their goods for all their economic relationships to go through the European country, right? So like Vietnam, for example, could only export and sell goods through France, right? Their selling of goods to anywhere else has to go through France. Well, in American capitalism requires the end of colonies, right? In a free market, in a completely free market, each country can sell to anyone else, right? And so the US is interested in ending colonies so that those countries become open to Afro-American capitalism, right? And it actually, the destruction of Japan works to the US favor, right? Two of the most heavily devastated countries at the end of the war are Japan and Germany, right? But they both get rebuilt on American dollars, largely. Well, Germany is split in two. The Soviets have a say there too. But Western Germany gets rebuilt by American dollars. And guess what? Both Japan and Western Germany become models of American capitalism. The US is selling Japan and Germany all over the world, telling everybody, see, this is what American capitalism can do. Look at how well Western Germany and Japan are doing after the war. You should adopt American capitalism too. And they're doing this everywhere, right? The US has figured out how to control the world without actually controlling all the territory of the world. They don't need European colonialism to control the world. If you control the economies of all these countries, it's cheaper because you don't have to spend money holding the territory. You just control them with the money. And that is the American strategy in Latin America, in Africa, and Southeast Asia is, hey, we're not interested in the direct control of you, but your economy basically belongs to the US. And via that, then the US has a lot of political power and a lot of political say everywhere in the world, right? This is how the American empire is built, on economic control of the world. And it's a good strategy for the US. The problem is empires rise and empires fall. And we're definitely, by the way, historians agree that the American empire is on the downward trend, but it hasn't officially fallen as far as scholars can tell. But all right, all of that really highlights, though, problems at home. Right? If the US is selling the Cold War, right? It's selling conflict abroad by saying that it's preserving freedom, right? We need to stop the Soviets so that people can have freedom. That's how the American government sells its Cold War wars. Well, what about all of the African Americans at home who don't have this same freedom? Right? African American veterans are coming back to a still segregated American South, not just the South, everywhere, but especially in the South, it's particularly like egregious. It stands out a lot. You have the lynching of African American veterans in the South after World War II. How can that be tolerated? How does this make sense? Well, America is fighting for freedom all over the world. It doesn't, right? And this pushes, there was already anti-segregation movements, a lot of anti-segregation activism in the South had been happening from the end of Reconstruction, right? People had been fighting it. But now there's a new intensity brought into the movement after having fought these two global wars in the name of freedom, right? It highlights the hypocrisy in the US even more. So it also helps push people, right? With job opportunities now all over the country, a lot of African Americans leave the South. Those that can, a lot of them leave the South, and they're coming to places like Los Angeles, like San Francisco, like Chicago, New York. They're going to cities where there are new factory jobs after World War II, during World War II and after World War II. And it's millions of African Americans. Like there's no program of moving people out of the South. It's people individually taking the decision to leave. And they're leaving and reshaping the way cities all over the US look, right? At the same time, though, there's now a growing movement, more and more support for the desegregation movement in the South, right? Now, you still need greater push, right? You still need Martin Luther King Jr., you still need Rosa Parks, you still need those people, but there's growing support for change in the South. So that's where we're going to go to next, is moving into that, because the situation in the South is really unlivable, right? After Reconstruction, the job that most African Americans have is sharecropping. And the way sharecropping worked was, the cotton fields, all the plantation owners still need labor on the plantation after the end of the Civil War. So these plantations continue. They continue to grow cotton and other crops, right? So this is for 100 years after the Civil War, this is continuing. So they still want Black people to work those jobs. So they offer people, all right, come work at our plantation. We'll give you a small chunk of land where you can build a house. The land's not yours, you're renting it, but we'll give you a chunk of land where you can build a house and have a small garden for yourself, but you have to work at the plantation. Okay, that seems great for a lot of people. But now that you're free, right, your labor's free, you're gonna have to pay for your own tools to harvest the cotton, to grow the cotton. I can't just give you that. I was giving it to you while you were my slave because I was taking care of you. Now you have to provide your own tools. And people are like, but I don't have tools. So the plantation owner says, okay, no problem. I can rent you or sell you my tools. How about that? Great, all right. Except they're going to charge, or they're going to overcharge for those tools. And so the person that's doing this work says, but I don't have the money to pay for these overly priced tools. The plantation owner says, well, no problem. I will loan you the money. So you'll just pay back, with every paycheck, you pay back a portion of the loan I've given with interest. And the interest rates in these loans are extreme. The result of this sharecropping is that African Americans are only growing in debt more and more. So most people can't leave because of the debt they're in to the plantation owner. And this is replicated generation after generation. So entire families are forced into poverty by this sharecropping system. And you might think, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stick in the plantation. I'm just going to go. Except leaving is not an option once you are already in debt. Once you're in debt to the plantation owner, he can issue, if you try to skip out on the loan, he can issue an arrest warrant that will find you anywhere you go to in the US. And in fact, if you left family back back at home, right? If you have a wife, if you have children, if you have siblings, parents, they're now forced to assume your debt and pay back your debt. It's an extremely unfair system, and it should have been illegal. It was illegal according to laws that were already in the books, but they changed those laws and allow this kind of sharecropping system to continue, right? And so we have people that are sharecroppers, right, who are stuck in this system of debt up until the most recent 20th century, right? And we'll talk about some of the other horrors happening in the South that should have been illegal, are illegal according to the 14th and 15th Amendments, but are allowed to continue to happen, right? And those are the things that people had been fighting against. The NAACP and other organizations in the South, activists had been trying to get new laws passed, to enforce the current laws, to change these things. But at least we're gonna get some movement on those changes after World War II. Okay, I will stop here. Questions, comments?